Good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Countering China and Russia in Latin America and the Caribbean. My name is Jenna Ben-Yehuda and I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Council. And this is a topic of personal interest. Great to see so many old friends here. Thanks to everybody for joining us. We'll be focusing on the nature of strategic competition that's intensifying both in European and Indo-Pacific theaters. China and Russia have made significant inroads within the Western Hemisphere over the last several decades. And at the same time, the U.S. approach to the region and strategic competition is in search, in some respects, of a new strategy. So we know that navigating strategic competition is a major defining challenge for the Atlantic Council to address across our various programs and centers. But we're here to investigate what does an effective strategy really look like for this region today in the current environment. So over the last 18 months, the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and the Adrienne Arsht Latin American Center, with support from the Global China Hub, have been working together to address just this very question. And that project has culminated in a new Atlantic Council strategy paper, which we are excited to launch today. We are so grateful to our speakers for joining us here today, and a special thanks to Congressman Joaquin Castro and Deputy Assistant Secretary Daniel Erickson for being here virtually. And we've also invited Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar, Chair of the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere. Thank you all for joining us, and it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Congressman Castro, Ranking Member on the United States House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere. Over to you. Thanks.
That probably means that it's my turn. I'm Congressman Joaquin Castro, and wanted to say thank you so much to Jenna for that wonderful introduction, and congratulations on the new role at the Atlantic Council, and thank you so much for all of your work at the Truman National Security Project as well. Thank you also to Jason Marzak and his team at the Adrienne Arsht Center for Latin America for all of the work that y'all have done on this issue. And then finally to Dan Erickson over at the Pentagon, thank you so much for your work and everything that you're doing, and the researchers who put so much time and energy and thought into this very important paper on countering China and Russia in Latin America. I have the honor of representing my hometown of San Antonio, Texas, in the United States Congress, and also serving as the ranking member for the subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere on the larger Foreign Affairs Committee. And so the group in its paper put together, I think, a very powerful frame for how we should think about countering both China and Russia in the Western Hemisphere. And they broke it down into 4 pieces: prioritize, invest, message, and align. And I want to talk about, I think, a few things from there that I feel are especially important and are congruent with their findings. The first, and I think every time I talk about China especially, I feel like it's worth saying and worth remembering that the United States is still the most prosperous and influential nation on the face of the earth. And that includes with respect to the Latin American countries as well. But as y'all know, China is working hard to dethrone us, and Russia has been working hard to disrupt us. And so we have to have a strategy on countering those things. And first, I think I want to go through a few, I think, especially salient points as we take on this challenge. The first is that we've got to give Latin America a greater stake in our partnership and in their relationship with the United States of America. I have said for years on the Foreign Affairs Committee that there are things that happen in places like Latin America and Africa that, if they happen in other parts of the world, would get a lot more attention from the United States Congress than they presently do. And so if there is any silver lining to the increased competition from China and Russia in Latin America, it is that we are paying more attention and actually doing a lot of the work and enacting the policies, or at least pursuing the policies that we should, to strengthen our relationship with Latin America. And so when I say give them a greater stake, I mean we should be working with zeal on achieving greater nearshoring being able to locate more of our workforce, more of our supply chain into the Western Hemisphere. That should be a whole of Congress and whole of government focus over the next generation. That spells out great things, not only for the United States, but also for our partners in Latin America. But we should also pay attention to not just the corporate or the private sector side, but also how we do development. We've got to give them a greater stake, and specifically to local NGOs and organizations in the development work that we do. Right now, as you all know, and Samantha Power has said it, and I agree with her, that a lot of our work is dominated by huge American NGOs, and they do important and wonderful work, but we've got to find a way to be more inclusive of the NGOs that are working locally, that are native to the countries that we're working in. This, I believe, will have a profound impact and create a situation where people are more grateful and also more excited and eager to work with the United States. Now, fortunately, some things we've done over the last few years have started to bear fruit. The USMCA, for example, a rewrite, or a NAFTA 2.0, a rewrite of NAFTA, has now had a great hand in making Mexico our largest trading partner. Mexico has surpassed China to become the United States' largest trading partner. That's incredibly important and very powerful going forward. We also saw in the last few years the creation in a bipartisan way of the DFC. They've got an important role to play, along with USAID and our other development organizations. We also can't overstate the role of the Vice President. First, Vice President Biden, when he worked under President Obama, and now Vice President Harris, as they have gone and tried to stoke private investment in the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, for example. Those are all important things that are bearing fruit, but also, I think, in the coming years will be increasingly important. So give the countries a greater stake in their relationship with the United States of America. And then also, that's on the economic side. We have to build up democracies on the government and political side. What China is selling is a different form of government. And really, we're almost appealing, of course, we're appealing to Latin American leaders and presidents and so forth. But if you step back and think about it, we're almost appealing to different crowds. What they're selling is to presidents and leaders of countries an autocratic style of government, an authoritarian style of government that says, we're going to help you with the technology, surveillance technology, and Huawei and other camera systems and surveillance systems that's going to allow you to surveil your people, to crack down on freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of press. We're going to allow you to make sure that you can control your people. And as you all know, for many leaders around the world, including in Latin America, even though Latin America, the countries have been quite democratic, some of them for quite a while, that's a very appealing prospect for a leader, to move from a president to in the direction of a king, quite honestly. What the United States is selling is something different. The United States is still trying to win the hearts and minds of the people of these countries. So the work of building up democracies, I'm proud to serve on the National Endowment for Democracy, which is mentioned in this report. The work of NED and other democratic building institutions is incredibly important, because one way that you stave off authoritarianism, in fact, I would argue the main way, is by building strong democratic institutions and giving the people of those nations a strong inclination towards democracy. So that's incredibly important as well. I would also say we've got to stick true to our values, stay true to our values. One of the things that has really hounded China is that they are a nation which has been very anti-immigrant over the years. They're also a nation, in part because of that, that is seeing a graying workforce and has seen a declining birth rate. And because of that, their GDP has gone from 75% of the United States GDP to 64% of the United States GDP. And we should not follow the same path that China has taken. Unfortunately, as you all know, hearing the coverage and the rhetoric of our times, I think the United States is in a once-in-a-generation period of virulent anti-immigrant sentiment. We have to push back. We have to remember that the United States became the most powerful, prosperous nation on earth, not in spite of immigrants, but because of immigrants. We've got to do everything that we can to make sure that we hold true to what has made us successful as a country. And when we think about Russia, I want us to make sure, both Russia and China, that we keep our perspective. And this is what I mean by that. The Russians are very intent on disinformation. I've sat on the Intelligence Committee now for about 7.5 years, was part of the committee when we did the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 elections. The reason that's important is because we've got to be vigilant about protecting against disinformation and misinformation. That's especially true as we're in the dawn of a new era in social media and artificial intelligence, where deep fakes could likely abound within the next few years, having profound effects even on elections, not only in the United States, but around the world and in Latin America. We've got to protect against that. It's going to be incredibly important going forward. I also mentioned that we've got to keep perspective. I hope that the panel today, and this would be a favor to legislators in the United States Congress, because I think as a Congress, we have so far failed to define this question that I want to pose to the panel. Although I will say the committee that was created, I think, has gone a long way in answering the question. And the question is this: what does it mean for China to fairly compete with the United States and other nations around the world, versus what does it mean for China to cheat? The answer to that question will determine how we approach China and deal with China, not only in Latin America, but in different situations and in different nations around the world. All of these things, I believe, are still in flux. And that's why this paper and this conversation today are incredibly important. Thank you so much, Jenna. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this. And I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, thanks to Congressman Castro for that summary of the report. Got to some of the tent poles, which is great. Saved some work for the rest of us. But let's get right into it. It's obviously a challenging time in the region. We've seen the threat from China pop up right in our backyards here in the United States. And not to mention, of course, in the region in Latin America and the Caribbean, spy stations, satellites, even, of course, a giant spy balloon that overflew most of the United States, which I'm sure you're all well aware of. Just briefly want to introduce my panelists before we jump in. Joining us virtually, we have Daniel Erickson, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere. At the table, Dr. Matt Koenig. He's the Vice President and Senior Director of the Scowcroft Center, and important to me as a foreign policy writer, he's a columnist at Foreign Policy Magazine as well. Dr. Victoria Chonn-Ching joins us virtually as well. She's a non-resident fellow here at the Adrian Arch Center at the Atlantic Council and a postdoctoral scholar and teaching fellow at the University of Southern California. And as well at the table, Clementine Starling, Director of Forward Defense at the Scowcroft Center. As we're going on through the discussion, we'll turn to questions in about 25 minutes here. So you can submit your questions at askac.org. And we'll be taking them as we go along. Dasdi Erickson, kind of to go off of the question that the congressman raised about what it means to fairly compete in the region for China as well as the Russians to a smaller degree. We've seen China expand their deep water ports, their cyber facilities, their space facilities, even put ground satellite stations in 4 countries in the region. We've seen the Russians look for military deals with the Cubans, the Venezuelans, and the Nicaraguans. How much has China expanded its footprint? How much has the Russians expanded their footprint? And what do you see as the risk level here? Seems like we're...
And can we get the volume?
We've lost the Dasdi.
We're having some difficulty hearing you, Dasdi Erickson. One moment.
Okay, I think we'll.
Yeah,
maybe go
while
to the
we
next
wait for
speaker
him,
while
let's
we, get that
let's just turn
fixed.
it into the room. And I'm curious, Matt, as you've gone through this report and researched it as well, What does fair competition look like to you? You talk about decoupling between Latin American countries and China and Russia. What are we looking at in the regional picture here?
Yeah, well, first I just want to say it was a pleasure to work on this project, and I manage the Scowcroft Center, which is our global strategy and security center. And so we've been focused on this challenge globally over the past several years. And so it was really great to partner with our Adrian Arsh Latin America Center to do a deep dive on this. And so we had a working group over 18 months, bringing together dozens of experts. And so Jason and Jeff and I were able to write up the findings, but really we were able to benefit from a lot of input. And so what is fair competition and unfair competition? If China wants to engage in market principles, buy soybeans from Brazil, for example, that's not a problem. The problem we focus on in this report is really more the malign influence of China and Russia engaging in sensitive military and intelligence efforts that could undermine American security and the security of our partners in the region. The unfair trading practices using state subsidies and intellectual property theft and other tools that are giving them a technology advantage in the region. And then also the threat that they potentially pose to democracy and human rights, and this was mentioned by Congressman Castro, but Russia systematically propping up anti-American regimes with military assistance. And think about the consequences if China controls 21st century infrastructure in the region. It's not just about technology now, but Huawei is the main dominant force in the region. And so if China embeds its autocratic norms in the technology in the region, what are the consequences for democracy and human rights? And so the focus of the report is countering these more malign forms of influence that could undermine American and regional security, prosperity, and freedom.
Clementine, you talked about we talked about in the green room a little bit that you see China making inroads into some of the key elements of the supply chain in the Western Hemisphere, critical minerals. You see them even expanding into space. How big is the threat?
Yeah, I think the things I'm concerned about are in Chinese investment in three main areas: deep water ports, which you mentioned, space infrastructure, so terrestrial facilities, and then the third, critical mineral mining. So maybe I'll just go through all three. So China has invested a lot in kind of deep water ports, so these kind of strategic maritime choke points. And in the report, credit to those who contributed to the report because it was very thorough and interesting. But China's let's start with its companies, its Chinese state-owned enterprises that are heavily subsidized by the Chinese government that enable really these companies to underbid a lot of other competitors, which is a big part of the problem. And the report really reflects on kind of how the US can help potentially support other companies and businesses to effectively be able to compete with the underbidding by Chinese SOEs. But I think particularly Chinese companies bidding on several projects related to the Panama Canal should be a concern for the US. This is the US's near abroad. In Argentina, on kind of a dual-use maritime installations in the southern part of Argentina, really enables China to it enables sustainment and power projection into the Antarctica, which really gives China kind of access that it doesn't have currently. I think on space in particular is where I'm quite concerned. Now, China has invested and continues to invest in about kind of 11 different facilities, space facilities in the region. Across kind of 5 different countries, so Bolivia, Venezuela, Peru, Argentina, and Bolivia. And there has been quite a bit of reporting. Not only is there kind of the renting of control to the PRC to be able to use these facilities for telemetry, tracking, and command, essentially kind of giving China access that it doesn't really have to, without these facilities, to track and communicate with its really growing fleet of satellites and space vehicles. So it fills a critical gap for China that it wouldn't have otherwise. But But also, there has been some intelligence that Beijing can remotely control some of these ground facilities. So why is that a problem? I mean, partially because there's the civil use of this, but there's also the military aspects of allowing China to kind of facilitate military communications, survey space assets that pass over the southern hemisphere. That enables China to do things that it wouldn't really otherwise be able to do in terms of jamming and other kind of counter space capabilities. So I think there's a lot to really focus on there. And then on the mining of rare earth elements, I mean, China dominates the global supply chain of rare earth elements at the moment. We all know how important critical minerals are for semiconductors and other advanced technologies. The US itself really needs to diversify its imports of critical minerals. But I think China's pretty sustained investment in critical mineral mining across the region should be a concern. Because it's enabling it to increase its stronghold over that market.
Got it. I do not see the DASD's smiling face on there, so let's go to Dr. Chonn-Ching. I'm curious, when you look at sort of what Clementine laid out, what do you see as China's end game here? What is China specifically trying to do to upend U.S. power in America's backyard, effectively?
Can you hear me? Just to make sure
we've got
that
you loud and
this
clear.
is working. Perfect. Okay, my concern was there. I think that the points that were raised are fair in regards to what's concerning about China, and yet I think that I would also view it from the perspective of the Latin American countries. And something that is very important is that even though, yes, China is coming with these very, concerning strategies for the United States, one way to also think about it is also what are the factors or what are the mechanisms that have allowed China to do so. And I think here's where we bring back the conversation about what the region is looking for, what many other countries are looking for, right? The kind of development that they're seeking and what China is offering. So I think that to turn the conversation and the concern of what China is doing to counter the US is not productive. I think that another way to also look at it is China's coming into the region to seek its own interests, right? Whether it is geopolitical, whether it's economic. So you have these two aspects. Yet on the other hand, right, you also have a China that will directly or indirectly sort of create this environment that, I guess, helps it to expand its allies. And for the U.S. to go into the region and it's raised in the report, and I think it's very important, right? When the U.S. goes into the region and says that we want to counter China, I think it's not productive. Rather, something important would be to say, we are coming in here and we want to become the partner of choice. I hope that makes sense, right? And these are the offers that we can give you vis-a-vis China. So I guess to get back to your question, and in many ways, is that yes, China in many ways wants to expand in influence, particularly, right, if it comes at the expense, if you will, of the United States. And yet, on the other hand, we also have to think about China also pursuing its own economic interest, which is really tied to its own development plans. And for many of the regions, those development plans, those development strategies actually coincide with what the countries want, which is development and modernization. So I think that we need to also think about it in a twofold way versus only the security aspect of this, which is concerning. And yet, for the region, for where countries are, we also need to bring in other aspects of it, which, again, like I said, development is really key.
Got it. Just a reminder for everyone in the audience here and digitally, ac.org is your place to submit questions, and we'll go to questions in about 10 minutes. Matt, to that point of partners of choice.
Well, I'm happy to go next, but I do see the DASD's back if you want to try to bring him in.
Yeah. DASD Erickson, I was in the middle of asking you sort of how you perceive from your vantage point at the Pentagon China and Russia's threat in the region. We've obviously seen the expansion of a lot of facilities that have concerned the experts here, as well as other folks in U.S. government. What's the risk level that you see China and Russia presenting in Latin America and the Caribbean?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, and I promise I wasn't dodging it. Just for some reason the screen flipped out. So first, I have to say we're monitoring very closely what's happening in this region as it relates to overall security and defense trends, and certainly with respect to the PRC as well as Russia. As your report, as the Atlantic Council report notes, the challenges posed by these two actors is different. And so there needs to be, I think, some adjustments to the strategies as well. I also think that while the Department of Defense plays clearly a very important role in terms of working with partner militaries in the region and enhancing defense cooperation and our ability to work together more seamlessly across multiple domains, including air, land, sea, space, and cyberspace, that there's some very important elements to the challenges posed by both the PRC and Russia that really require a whole of government response, because there are economic interests that are being pursued by these countries, by both PRC and Russia, and clearly political and diplomatic elements as well. From our perspective, the key issue here is prioritization, and really taking a look as what is happening in this region that poses a core risk or threat to U.S. interests and to our allies, and what type of activity is taking place that may have some disadvantages or may even be net neutral, but can't be the primary focus of our attention. Certainly, we're extremely concerned about malicious activities that we see in cyberspace. We also want to keep a very close eye on the space domain. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference hosted by U.S. Southern Command, which was co-sponsored by U.S. Space Command and U.S. Northern Command, to meet with the military components from across Latin America that engage in space, and really to exchange ideas and best practices as it relates to space situational awareness and other elements. And then I do want to also draw this back to a theme that Congressman Castro mentioned at the top of his remarks about the importance of democracy and democratic governance in this region as being one of the United States' core alliances, and something that we can really have as foundational to our partnerships here. We at DoD take very seriously the need to model civilian control of the military, respect for human rights, ensuring that militaries are abiding by the constitutional norms put forth by their democratic governments. There have been episodes in the region recently where there's been some concern about where militaries are heading, particularly in democracies. And we have been, by and large, gratified that for the most part, we have seen military respect the norms of democratic governance. So that's a core element as well. But Jack, as you point out in your question, and as I heard from some of the other panelists in the discussion, this really is an extremely complex strategic environment for the countries of Latin America and for the United States. The United States has been saying, depending on how you count, for the past 20 years, for the past 50 years, for the past 100 years, that we can't take Latin America and the Caribbean for granted. But today, that is absolutely a fact. And so me and my office and my counterparts from across the United States government are working every day to strengthen those partnerships and those relationships to ensure that this region remains one that is stable, prosperous, democratic, and at peace.
I want to get back to the panel in the room in just a moment, but I know we have Dazdy Erickson for a limited amount of time. So I just wanted to ask you, sir, I know there's always a common talking point from this administration and many administrations that you're not asking countries in the region to choose between the United States, China, Russia, what have you. But on the other hand, what should the United States be doing to mobilize or come up with alternatives to Chinese technology and investment like Huawei and Russian arms as we see that accelerating?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's critical that the U.S. private sector, U.S. industry, and the relevant U.S. agencies are engaging with this region to ensure that we can make available offerings, whether it's in defense, cyber, or in other areas to meet the core national security needs of these countries. And one message that I carry in my engagements with the region is that it's really very important for the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean to protect their critical national security infrastructure and ensure that they are only using trusted vendors. And as you stated, there are other competitors out there. Huawei is one, where they may not be trustworthy or may create vulnerabilities to governments if they're using these systems. And so that is a key element. I also think that across US industry, there really needs to be a deeper dive into what we can do to provide Latin American and Caribbean countries with the capabilities that they require at a price that they can afford. These governments are fiscally constrained. Many of them are still coming out of the economic challenges that were posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. They, in many cases, have also underinvested in critical infrastructure for many years. And so I think that it's extremely important that while, yes, it's true that the United States is the most valued partner of many of these countries, and yes, it's true that many of these countries would prefer to use US technology and equipment, it does at some juncture come down to affordability. And so I think that a broader look of how the United States can assist on the financing side is going to be very key into the future.
Matt, we've heard a lot about sort of the democracies versus autocracies framing here. Obviously, that's been a huge framing for the administration, for the Congress as it's come up. I'm curious, when you look at U.S. engagement across the region, obviously we've seen the last two presidents only go to the region once. Should the administration be prioritizing engagement with democracies over autocracies? How do you sort of square that circle when you look at the strategic picture in the region?
I think the short answer is yes. And if you look at some of the countries that are most problematic from the point of view of the United States, Nicaragua, Cuba, they are anti-American autocracies that are being supported by Russia. And so we do have a piece in the paper about countering these autocracies and supporting opposition movements within those governments. Venezuela, of course, I'd add to that list. And then prioritize is the first pillar of the strategy. And if you look, President Xi of China has made many visits to the region. One of the interesting kind of anecdotal pieces of evidence that came out of the discussions are just how Chinese diplomats' Spanish language skills have improved over the years, to just show how much they're prioritizing the region. And so I think we do need to prioritize it. It's our own backyard, and if we're threatened there, it's going to be much harder to take on Russia and China in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Another key piece of the strategy that I want to highlight is align. Because I think one of the United States' greatest strengths is its global network of allies and partners. So the United States doesn't have to do this on its own. It can work with Europe. It can work with Japan and Korea. All of those allies do have interests in the region. The European Union developing a new kind of mechanism to compete with BRI to provide infrastructure investments. On messaging the threat posed by Chinese technology dominance in the region, we recommend inviting representatives from the region to participate in the US-EU Trade and Technology Council dialogues so that they can learn from their European counterparts about some of the challenges they see with Huawei. So yes, I think focusing on democracies, countering autocracies is a part of this strategy, while of course having pragmatic engagement with friendly countries that may be teetering between those two categories.
Clementine, one interesting thing the DASD said was that sometimes it's too expensive for countries in the region to go to the American alternative. Is that something that you see in your research when you were talking about Chinese investment in some of these sectors, that they're presenting a better deal in some of these cases?
Yes, is the short answer on that. Yeah, this is hard. This is a really difficult square to circle. Because, yeah, the fiscal constraints that the DASD was mentioning are very real. And I think the way China is set up economically with Civ Mill fusion, we don't have the same offering to US companies or to other international companies that enable them to offer more competitive prices. So this is really, really difficult to compete with Chinese SOEs or Chinese companies that are indirectly linked to the Chinese government because they can offer more competitive prices. I think what the DASD said about that was really important is kind of the US needs to make sure that we are continuing to share information and really exposing some of the military purposes of the PRC's kind of scientific and academic investments in the region. I think this is becoming more and more well known with BRI, but I feel like we're probably talking about it a little bit less in terms of Latin America and the Caribbean. So we need to keep making that clear. And then, of course, this is a difficult proposition for countries that desperately need the investment in critical infrastructure. And I do think we need to be creative about working with our own commercial industries about what alternative offerings we can provide. But there aren't easy solutions to this.
Well, I want to get to Dr. Chonn-Ching again in a second, but I know we might have limited time with the DASD. So if I can get DASD Erickson on one more point, which is sort of, as Clementine mentioned, sort of some of the military purposes that you see for China's projects. Are there sort of any red lines or blinking red lights when you look at it as a policymaker from the Pentagon that Chinese investment or Russian investment in the region shouldn't cross?
Sure. I mean, I think in some ways, it's two different issues. I mean, I think with regard to PRC investment in the region, we're, as your other speaker said, we're just very concerned about dual use technologies that may seem to be more fit for scientific, civilian, academic purposes, but may in fact have a military intent or be linked back to activity by the PLA. And what we find in the region is that there are many countries, particularly our core partners, that are concerned about China and are concerned about the PRC's growing role. It's just not on at the top of their list of concerns. They're facing transnational criminal organizations at home, climate threats, still ongoing border disputes in a number of countries, and so they look at the risk posed by PRC is something that is going to come perhaps in the future, but not today. And so really educating our partners and making sure they're aware of how some of the decisions that they take today could create long-term risk for them is really critical. When it comes to Russia has a slightly different position in the region because there are many governments that have for many years used Russian military equipment. And so they've been basically acclimated to that. And of course, with the conflict in Ukraine and the role of sanctions, et cetera, they're realizing that maybe it's best to shift to other types of equipment, but they're trying to figure out the financing to do that. And so this is an ongoing conversation. And it's one that we take very seriously, that our partners have interest in. And I know, as you stated, I do have to sign off soon. This may be my last comment, and I apologize. I got started a little late due to the tech issues. But I think at the end of the day, the way that the United States can meet the challenge that's posed by great power competition in Latin America and the Caribbean is really by having a very proactive, affirmative, and engaged U.S. agenda with the region, and not just telling other countries what they shouldn't be doing with other partners, but what they can do with the United States. And I think that over the past several years of the Biden-Harris administration, there actually has been a lot that we've achieved, and progress that's been made on a number of fronts that's extremely important. Not all of it is kind of headline grabbing type of stuff, but stuff that will make a real difference to the defense industrial base of our partners. It makes a real difference and contribution in our ability to operate effectively with our partner armed forces in the region. And it's those sorts of building blocks that we're putting together today that will make a long-term difference for U.S. security and for the long-term prosperity and security of Latin America and the Caribbean.
Got it. I wanted to turn to some questions from the audience since we're actually belated on doing that. Start with a question from Wenhao Ma, and I might actually pose this to Dr. Chonn-Ching. How concerned are you about China's disinformation and propaganda push in the Latin American region? And per the first question that you answered, I'm curious what you see as behind that push as well.
Thank you for the question. I mean, it is concerning, right? Because you have messaging that can happen in very subtle ways. For instance, social media, the increase of social media, the increase of bots and what have you. And I think a lot of the messaging comes into building China's image in that it is a friendly partner. It is a party that wants to work with many countries in the region. And yet, right, at the same time, also comes with the message of this is how we can do better vis-a-vis the United States. This is just a general example. And something that, for instance, the United States can do, and the panelists, and I think even Congressman Castro has pointed out, right, is to reprioritize the U.S. interests in the region and present itself not only as a partner of choice, but also highlight, and here is where this is the other part of the report that perhaps hasn't been emphasized enough is the messaging, right? Messaging in the sense that the United States does carry a lot of the values that many of the Latin American countries appreciate, which comes with transparency, accountability, and whatnot. So to work with that would be helpful. And in many ways, it is, as the panelists have said, very complex, because how do you deal with information that you cannot necessarily prove? And I think that here is not necessarily proof, but information that cannot be separated reality from I guess the malintent purpose, right? So in this instance, it's very important that not only working with companies, not only working with the state, but also civil society. And I think that this is something that is not mentioned enough. I think that Congressman Castro did mention it in terms of what USAID has been doing and whatnot. Working with civil society is very important, not only American civil society, but actually local civil societies, in emphasizing the kind of messaging that we want to communicate, right? We want to expand to counteract that kind of disinformation that is present.
Dasdi Erickson, I see we still have you for at least the moment. Have a question from the audience. What do you see as the role of the military and Southcom in countering Chinese and Russian influence in the region specifically?
Sure, I did. You're right. I did stay on the line because I wanted to be able to answer at least one question. So thank you for handing that one to me. The core activity that the U.S. military is undertaking, and certainly in the form of U.S. Southern Command, which is the key geographic combatant command that covers 31 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, all but Mexico and Bahamas, is really to work with these partners in terms of deepening their own capabilities, joint exercises and training, working on both bilateral challenges, but regional challenges. There's an instinct frequently to talk about working with Latin America and the Caribbean as a region, but every country has its own unique bilateral issues and domestic issues that it needs to confront as well. Southcom has also done a tremendous job, really, in terms of working with countries in cyber and helping to develop cybersecurity. In many governments in Latin America and the Caribbean, cybersecurity is really a differentiated responsibility that falls upon a number of different agencies, and yet it's frequently the defense ministries and armed forces that are asked to kind of take it on. And so Southcom has done a great deal of work as it relates to cyber. And then, there's really the more basic stuff too: humanitarian assistance and disaster response, ensuring ability to enhance climate resilience, which is really key in a region that's been tremendously affected by this. And the OSD policy has a fantastic relationship with U.S. Southern Command. I was just with the General Laura Richardson, the U.S. Southcom commander, in Panama last week for a set of high-level security dialogues with the Panamanian government, which included meetings with the canal administrator. And so this is a very important element in our overall defense engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean. And with that, Jack, I would like to thank you very much for having me on. Again, sorry I got a slightly late start, but it's been great to hear the panel. I wish I could be there in person and not here at the Pentagon, but it wasn't how the schedule unfolded today. But I do look forward to seeing continued conversation about this very important set of issues. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, let's bring it back into the room. Matt, a couple of questions on the report from the audience. One, how can this strategy be executed, especially in this context, this climate of three wars engulfing the globe? And what role do allies and partners have to play here?
Yeah. Well, the United States certainly has its handful, a major war in Europe, a war in the Middle East, trying to deter Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific. I think the United States is still a global superpower, and we really don't have the luxury of choosing. We have important interest in those three regions, but also, obviously, in our own backyard. And so I think we do need to find a way to have a global strategy to deal with Russia and China, including in Latin America. And we still have the capacity to do it. You know, the United States is 25% of global GDP. Russia and China combined, only about 18%. So even on our own, I think we're strong enough. But you bring in our global allies and partners, to your second question, we're roughly 60% of global GDP. And so working together, we can do this. And allies and partners are critical, as I mentioned before, getting the Europeans engaged in the region, the Japanese, the Koreans. I think Congressman Castro mentioned friendshoring. I think that's an important part of this as well, as we look to secure supply chains and move trade and supply chains out of China. Bringing them to friendly countries in the hemisphere, I think, makes a lot of sense. And one of the ways that we can provide an economic alternative to China. So yes, we've got to do it all, and we've got to do it with allies and partners.
Wonderful. Clementine, one for you from our audience, a contextual question as well. How do you view China's economic slowdown and also Russia's war in Ukraine sort of limiting the investment in these spaces that you talked about, space, critical minerals, some of the other projects you mentioned?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for Russia, we've all been surprised by how much Russia has been able to kind of continue its engagements and activities globally, often virtually, in other parts of the globe. So there is an element of course, that the war in Ukraine is occupying a lot of human power and military power. But what the Russians are able to do in other spaces, you know, both physically and virtually, I don't think that there's as much of a slowdown, perhaps, in some activity in other parts of the world that we might have expected. In terms of the Chinese economy, I am not an economist, but yeah, of course, there are big questions about the trajectory of the Chinese economy and the ways in which that will impact kind of what China is able to do. I don't think I think China's global footprint really speaks for itself. I don't think that necessarily we're going to see a big drawdown in Chinese investments in other parts of the world anytime soon. But yeah, I mean, that's something to watch for.
Let's zoom in on one specific region within Latin America, Central America. Dr. Chonn-Ching, a question from the audience about China's push to get Central American countries not to recognize Taiwan. Can you talk a little bit about that push? And also, it seems like there's some market activity from the Chinese there as well. Are those two pieces interlinked as you see it?
The first question, if you allow me, in terms of how the Chinese economy, the issues is affecting Latin America. I'm actually a political economist in this regard. So in this case, I think that what we will see is, yes, the expansion of Chinese investment, but not necessarily in the larger scale that we have seen before. What we're going to see is actually a smaller scale and very targeted, especially in the areas that are concerning, which is minerals, lithium, right? Renewable energy, innovation, high tech, and most importantly, digital infrastructure. So these are very pointed pointed investments, but they're targeted not at the large scale that we have seen before, but it's still happening. So just that very quickly. And in terms of Central America, yes, it is interlinked. And that's precisely, I guess, tied with the previous question, right? Because one of the strategies that China has done is, right, going to that part of the world or that sub-block in the Latin American region and pretty much said, right, this is the kind of support, financial and many times aid support that we are going to provide to you if you work with us. And I think that that's precisely what we have seen, for example, in the case of Honduras and even in El Salvador, right? Not El Salvador, Nicaragua, in the sense that you have this, I guess, offering or negotiation that is not directly saying you have to turn your diplomatic relations and directly recognize us, but rather say, right, these are deals that we are going to offer you. And if you collaborate with us, if you recognize us, this is what we are going to be able to give to you. And I think that that's something that needs to be highlighted, how China uses this so-called soft economic power to really pursue its geostrategic or geopolitical interests within the region. And I'm sure that the United States, and I think that as Minister Erickson mentioned before, who is not right now in there, is paying attention to. But again, how can the United States highlight and how can the United States provide the kind of offering that China can provide, and not necessarily economically speaking, but for instance, institutionally, governance, right, that this part of the world also needs, and therefore counteract in another way this growing Chinese influence.
About time for our panel. I appreciate all of your comments, and let's turn to Jason Marchak now, the Vice President of the Latin America Center here, for some closing remarks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jack. I'd like to begin by thanking our speakers, including Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere, Dan Erickson, and Representative Joaquin Castro, ranking member on the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere. Also like to reiterate, it's great to always welcome those on the subcommittee and look forward to its chair, Representative Salazar, joining us at a later date. As shown throughout today's event, and as the work of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center highlights, this hemisphere should be recognized for its growing importance for the U.S. and increasingly for the global community. Half of the U.S.'s free trade agreements are with countries from Latin America and the Caribbean, and U.S. exports to the region are second only to Asia. As well, the region is home to 3 of the world's top 5 countries with the largest copper reserves, as well as 60% of the world's lithium reserves. This point is especially relevant to today's conversation, given China's efforts to incorporate Latin American Caribbean countries as part of its own critical mineral supply chains. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. As you've heard today, amid a shifting global landscape defined by increasing geostrategic competition with countries such as China and Russia, the United States needs new strategies to rejuvenate its partnerships with Latin America and the Caribbean and to counter growing malign Chinese and Russian influence in the region. At the Atlantic Council, we have worked to develop these strategies to respond to this need, and I'm again pleased to co-author this strategy paper released today with Matt Kronig and Jeff Semino. I'd like to leave with a few takeaways from the strategy paper. Malign actions by China and Russia threaten the U.S. in its own hemisphere and must be a high priority for U.S. foreign and defense policy. Note that I said malign action, as this paper is concerned with not all actions, but countering those forms of influence that undermine the security, prosperity, and freedom of the U.S. and the region. As well, it's important to distinguish that China and Russia have different goals and capabilities in the region. China seeks to leverage its economic power to increase its influence in other areas of competition, whereas Russia continues to support anti-American authoritarian regimes militarily and spread disinformation to undermine U.S. interests. As Congressman Castro said, China seeks to dethrone the U.S. and China to disrupt the United States. To achieve the goals of advancing the security, prosperity, and freedom and countering the malign influence of China and Russia, the United States should implement a strategy, as we say in the paper, that focuses on prioritization, investment, messaging, and alignment. On prioritization, in particular, as Dasti Erickson said, we must ask what really poses a threat to the United States and focus on those specific aspects of Chinese and Russian influence. And the report launched today is a critical step toward elevating the importance of regional prioritization for the United States overall. It will be complemented by another Atlantic Council strategy paper of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and the Adrian Arch Latin America Center to be launched later this month, titled Redefining U.S. Strategy with Latin America and the Caribbean for a New Era. That forthcoming paper will place a shared commitment to inclusive economic opportunity in the Western Hemisphere as the central organizing principle of the partnership, and highlights opportunities for further advancing a proactive agenda, as Dasti noted its importance, that meets the region where shared interests align. So stay tuned for more as this U.S.-SLAC Strategy Month unfolds here at the Atlantic Council. Once again, thank you to the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, the Global China Hub of the Atlantic Council, as well as to all those joining us in studio, those watching on ACTV, and those tuning in via C-SPAN. Have a great rest of the afternoon.